So you'd be pleased to know that I only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try and keep inside that. And also, I'm not here to talk about product. So I thought I'd pick something that was relevant to what we do, but hopefully a bit educational as well. So I just want to take these 10 minutes just to give you an update on what we're seeing in the threat landscape with respect to DDoS and how things are changing. So I'm sure you're saying, well, you know, what can be that new with DDoS attacks? Attacks get bigger, end of story, right? Well, yeah, I mean, there's a certain element of that, and you look back over the last 20 years or so, right back from the early days of, you know, notoriety-driven attacks, and actually sort of probably in the middle period there was a bit of a lull. DDoS sort of went out of fashion, but it's certainly come back into fashion in the last 5+ years. And you know, in more recent years, we started to see the first sort of cases of really big sort of saturating attacks, you know, hundreds of gigabits, and Spamhaus was a good example of that. But even more recently, I don't know if anyone's seen in the press, but you know, the Rio Olympic Games were subject to you know, a huge aggregate attack, 500 gigabits plus, allegedly. And you know, while there's easy targets for the attackers to compromise and generate these large-scale attacks, you know, those type of headline-grabbing attacks will definitely continue. You know, reportedly, the Rio Olympics attack was based on a botnet created from, well, say thousands, tens of thousands of compromised Internet of Things devices, so home Internet-enabled devices, home routers that can either have very little or no security on them, or can be easily brute-forced because nobody changes the default passwords on them, harvested to then create a large attack. You know, while those are still there, we're going to keep seeing these. And it feels like they happen regularly enough, but from our perspective, this isn't the main part of the challenge with DDoS today, and that's something I was going to come on to in a few minutes. Now, as an industry, you know, we try and do things to stop these attacks. You know, try and look for the kind of the big gaping holes that the attackers are exploiting. And earlier this year, NTP.org released a whole bunch of patches which were specifically related to addressing vulnerabilities that DDoS attackers have been using to create NTP reflection attacks. And since then, we've seen, good news, we've seen a corresponding significant drop in the amount of DDoS attacks where NTP is being used as the amplification mechanism. But as ever, and I know it was mentioned earlier that maybe attackers that, you know, aren't as smart as we kind of, you know, create this aura around them, but you know, they are constantly innovating, and there are always those helpful ethical hackers who like to point out the new vulnerabilities that they've found in people's software to try and do everyone a favour, and those are the sort of things that then actually get exploited and do cause us trouble, and TFTP is a good example of that. And only this year, someone presented a white paper on a potential vulnerability in TFTP. You know, combination of two things: the fact that there are actually tens of thousands of TFTP servers that are openly accessible on the internet for some reason. There's no reason for them to need to be, but they are. And combine that with the fact that it's not an authenticated protocol, a fairly simple kind of brute force attack results in an amplification mechanism that's pretty similar to what you can achieve with DNS. So as soon as you close down one hole, another one opens up. And we've actually already seen that for the keen-eyed of you. I'm not sure if you can see it on these screens, but you know, there's a timeline chart here showing that we've actually seen some of these attacks in the wild. There's this big purple hump of traffic in the middle there, which kind of pushes the whole graph up. And that is actually port 69 traffic, which is TFTP. So we've definitely already seen these attacks using this mechanism going on in the wild. So we talked about these big super-saturating attacks, but the title of my little slot was sub-saturating attacks, and this is something that we've certainly started to see much more of being the case. You see these big headline-grabbing attacks. Well, in parallel with those, there is a rise in the types of attacks that effectively don't saturate. They do generate just enough traffic to take out their target, but without necessarily doing that by filling up the whole pipe that's going into that organisation. And when we looked back across our statistics for several quarters, we could back that up by saying that actually over 80% of the time, attacks are only lasting for maybe 10 minutes or so. And see there, over 90% of the time, the attacks are less than 1 gigabit in size. So that's quite contrary to the the Spam House attack or the Rio Olympics attack where you're talking about hundreds of gigabits. And basically this just demonstrates that attackers have either, it's hard for them to generate those big attacks, although they are possible, you have to go to a lot of effort. Okay, maybe that fills up the whole pipe that's kind of in front of a particular organisation, but if you've got a particular server, application, website that organisation is running, if you only need to generate enough traffic to take that out. So if you can generate a surgical DDoS attack, it doesn't have to be very long, and it just has to be the right amount of traffic, you can actually have just as much of an effect. And I picked out this chart from one of our customers that kind of illustrates that. This is one of our service provider customers, and you can see that the green band of traffic at the bottom, that's just the constant good traffic that's going across this provider's backbone network. And then the red traffic on top is the traffic that we're seeing that is identified as DDoS traffic, and we're blocking that as well in this instance. But you can see there's a constant background there of ongoing small DDoS traffic, and then you get a particular attack comes along. The attacker ramps up that traffic, so that the low-level traffic was a few gigabits, suddenly it ramps up to 10 or 20 gigabits, and then they still see no effect. So they ramp it up a bit more, and you get 60, 70 gigabits of traffic. That's them trying to do just enough to take out the target. And then they give up. They don't try that forever. They do a bit and they go, okay, either they've figured they can't generate enough to take out that target, or they've actually figured out there's some protection in place and they give up. But it's a good example of how surgical they can be, rather than just filling the whole pipe. As you can see, the chart here goes up to 100 gigabit. That's the full bandwidth that we're looking at here. They're not filling that whole pipe, or the whole aggregate pipe is multiple 10 gigabit links aggregated together. But they're not filling that whole pipe. They're just doing enough that they think they need to do to actually be effective with their attack. And the challenge we have is, this isn't going away. There's big business here. There's many motives. There's the kind of the more traditional motives like the political and belief-driven DDoS attacks. But increasingly, there's things like ransom and extortion. And then, the FBI has already said this year they think that the aggregate value of ransom attacks is going to be approaching $1 billion in itself. Just that subset of cybercrime, because of the ease with which they can do it. And when an attacker understands how much value there is in your online business, they can then just figure out, okay, how much is every minute of your online business worth, and then set a ransom accordingly. And then a threat of a large DDoS attack, or actually delivering one and then not turning it off until you pay up, is very easy for them to do. And the third thing is around using DDoS attacks as a smokescreen for other targeted attacks. So TalkTalk was mentioned earlier, and part of that attack was actually a DDoS attack. So launching a small DDoS attack that can take out a server and application within that environment gets the IT team focusing on that and not focusing on the real motive for the attack. And the other benefit of doing these surgical attacks is you're not blocking your way into that organisation while that attack's running. If you're not filling up the whole pipe, you've still got your way in to do your command and control, plant your malware, whatever it is you're doing, and extract and exfiltrate your data while that's going on. And it's easy for people to do this now. It's easy to find applications that enable you to launch your own DDoS attacks, or even buy DDoS as a service. There's many websites out there now where you just, you don't need any kind of intelligence as far as programming skills. You just need to have the motive, know what the target is, and have a sense of how much traffic you think you need to throw at them to take them offline. And you go in, you put in those parameters, and you pay your money, and while you're paying your money, that service effectively runs and does the DDoS attack for you. So it's increasingly easy to do it, which just means it's not going to go away. So why should we care? Wrapping up now, keep it short. Firstly, cost. At the end of the day, as service providers, you're aggregating traffic for tens, hundreds, maybe more customers. If any particular customer is only targeted a couple of times a week, a couple of times a month, you aggregate that across all of the customers that you support, and that means at any particular time, there's potentially a significant portion of your bandwidth which is being taken up with bad traffic. you can realise that bandwidth back, release it back. You can either support more customers or give better service to the customers that you have. Reputation. So we found that actually a lot of sort of end users, enterprises, businesses are expecting that their service provider is already delivering some kind of protection with respect to DDoS. So when they do actually get hit and find out that that wasn't the case, that's not necessarily going to reflect too well on you, and means that they would potentially be looking around for another provider. But there is an opportunity here, and what we've seen is if you pick the right solution, you can actually not only get that protection within your environment and make sure that bad traffic is not traversing across your network, and then obviously subsequently protecting your customers, but there's the ability to sell that on as a service, which means that you actually can end up generating an additional revenue stream that recoups even more than the original outlay. So with that, and now we're getting on to the break, so I'll just say, just remind you, there is this perception that businesses are protected by their service provider. So just think, are you doing it, and are the tools that you're using able to protect against these more surgical attacks, or are you just still thinking in terms of these high volume saturating attacks? Thank you.
Okay, we got one question from Trev there, and then it's time for coffee.
Trev from Lonap again. Just out of interest, have you got examples of enterprises who are willing to pay for this kind of service? Because it was a little bit of a contradiction in this. On one hand, you say they're expecting the ISP or the service provider to provide it. On the other hand, you see it as a business opportunity.
Well, I think there's a lot of what we've seen is there's expectation that is already provided. I think it's if you point out that it isn't, there's the ability then to sell it on as a service. And we have multiple service provider type customers that are already working on doing exactly that. So selling the DDoS protection on as a service to their customers in a tiered level. So a base level, they have the protection in place. If you get attacked by a DDoS attack and you haven't paid for the service, your traffic just gets black holed basically. So the attack's perfected. You haven't got taken down, but you actually haven't got any traffic flowing, and then you sell the service level on top of that. So, gold, silver, bronze type level. I'll protect you from this sort of size of attack, and then I'll black hole you, or I'll protect you from all the way up to my limit, and then black hole you. So there is potential to then, to sell it on as a service. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sean.
All right, thanks.